Welcome to Digital Marketing ROI, the podcast that connects marketing to your business's revenue and covers everything you need to know to stay up to date in this crazy digital marketing world.
Welcome to Digital Marketing ROI. I'm your host, Shannon Allen, and I'm joined by my favorite co-host, Crystal Vivian. February.
Happy February. It's crazy that it's already February and we're almost halfway through the month.
I know.
Usually February drags on forever.
We're going to be in our bathing suits before you know it. I'm going to be on my boat before you know it. How about that?
I'll take that.
I'll bring
I'm
you
just thrilled that it's 40 degrees.
Well, maybe we need to do a podcast on the pontoon boat.
I love that
We could
idea.
do that with sound.
No, it'll sound terrible, but we'll have a great time.
We'll have a great time. We'll just play music during the whole podcast. How's that?
There you go.
All right. I'm excited. February is the month of streaming TV. I want to talk about streaming. I want to talk about CTV. I want to talk about how the year is shaping up. And I did a training on this with the team, and there's just so much information that I think is going to be really good for our listeners. Do you agree?
I agree. And I think that it's something that we've been talking about for a long time, but that's because so much is changing with it so fast. Now is really the time for businesses to make their moves and start investing and getting into the CTV space.
Absolutely. And what we're going to do today for our listeners is we're going to talk about what's really happening, which is one of the biggest shifts in advertising right now, which is honestly the collapse of cable and broadcast TV viewership and why streaming has permanently taken the throne. So today in part one, we're going to really break down the data and talk about understanding viewership between cable and broadcast versus streaming, right? And where consumers, business owners need to be moving their money because of where consumers are.
Yep.
Let's get into it. I'll let you ask me some questions, and hopefully when we're done, our listeners will have a good idea of where they should be spending their money.
Absolutely. Shannon, I'd like to start right there with consumer behavior and what's changed, because we've all been streaming for years, right? And we've been watching streaming grow for years. But December 2025, so just 2 months ago, Nielsen data shows that there's a huge tipping point, probably the biggest one so far. Can you walk us through what happened and why business owners need to be paying attention?
Yeah, so let's backtrack a little. I'm going to give a stat that we've talked about many times on the podcast, which is back in May was really where the tipping point started. Nielsen came out with the numbers in May where finally streaming had moved past the combination of cable and broadcast together. It was at almost 45% versus combined cable and broadcast that was just under 44%. We started talking about this with our clients way back then. However, as the end of the year rolled around, I went to pull numbers as I was going out to talk to a client that does spend a substantial amount of money in cable. What I really was able to show our client, it's okay to run on cable and broadcast, but you also have to match the viewership to your budget. It cannot be skewed. The biggest notes that happened in Nielsen's The Gauge, which is their statistical information from all of their surveys, in December of 2025, streaming hit an all-time record of 47.5% of all TV viewing. So that shattered the previous record that was back in July of 2025. Meanwhile, cable dropped to its lowest level ever recorded, just 20.2% of TV viewing. Right behind that is broadcast TV. They're neck and neck there, right? So now we're moving up to that 50% of viewership, and then everything else below it is living in the cable and the broadcast. And keep in mind, when we say cable is at 20%. That box sitting on somebody's TV is 20% of viewership. When we talk about broadcast, if that percentage is 20% and you are buying on your local CBS station or your local NBC station, you're not 20% of viewership. You're a percentage of all the major networks combined.
Correct.
So ABC, NBC, Fox, right? All of those combined make up that 20% mark. So if you might be buying something that's only getting 5 to 8% of viewership, but you're spending the bulk of your money there.
And you have to guess that is where your target audience is spending their time watching. Even if they are watching broadcast, you're guessing that they're watching the local NBC station, or you're guessing that
Exactly.
they're watching Bravo on cable.
Exactly. It comes down to the math and follow the consumer journey. So that's really the big thing that I wanted to talk about to kick this off is to start to think about, does your budget match up to the viewership and really dissect that as a whole? That was where my client was buying cable, but the bulk of their streaming budget was going to cable, yet their inventory was running on the cable box, not on the streaming box. And a good portion of that budget was going to live sports, which is going to be our part two of today's podcast. We'll get to live sports and how that affects these particular numbers. What I want our listeners to think about right now is viewership of streaming as a whole. And now there's a lot of things that run under streaming, right? We're talking Netflix, we know alone, Netflix alone covers 9% of that 50%. And I'm using 50 just to round it up.
Yeah.
Prime Video, 4.3, Paramount Streaming, 2.5, Roku Channel, 3%. And then what's not included in there, which is that extra other probably 20%, are what we call the multi-platform video on demand, which is subscription is YouTube TV, the Hulu Live,
Hulu Lives, the
thing.
Slings.
Yes, that's what makes up that other percent. Just on a side note, weirdly enough, Christmas Day became the most streamed day in TV history with 55.1 billion viewing minutes in a single day, shattering the previous record by 8%.
Well, and
Games.
but all the
There's
sports
games.
games
There's
were on
sports
streaming.
games.
Netflix
Sports
had.
Yep. We'll talk about that. A year ago, I told a client, the tide is turning. You will be watching everything you want to do on streaming for sports in the future.
I think we talked about that on a podcast. I'll have to go back and find out which one, but I'm pretty sure we talked about that on a podcast too. So yes. Cable's at its lowest point ever. Let's look into the rest of 2026. Where do we expect the industry to go? Where do experts think that we're heading for cable through the rest of 2026? And at what point does cable really become unsustainable for advertisers?
Great question. Industry analyst Evan Shapiro predicts cable will drop another 13.4% year over year from July 2025 to July of 2026, which would put it about 18 to 19% of TV by mid 2026. So now we're below that 20% mark, right? That's crucial. You know, when streaming is predicted to cross the 50% line and cable keeps losing that viewership, that is crazy. One of the stats I pulled was that cable penetration has dropped from 88% of US households in 2010 to below 38%. That's a 50-point decline. Wow. And something that I was asked by one of my clients was, don't you think the affluent buyer is the older generation and they're sitting with a cable box? And I said, it is an older audience. I can tell you that it's not a younger audience, but let's think about that. Do you want to reach the 65 plus? My mom's 75. She streams. She doesn't have a cable box. Yep. Everything is streaming.
My parents are 60. My father-in-law is 70, and they all stream everything. I think my parents have satellite, but it's just for the local sports. That's it.
Yeah. An older generation has more money to spend, but if you're talking about retirees, they're not spending the way that I am at 55.
Right.
I'm his audience.
Yes.
And I haven't been on the satellite for 5 years.
100%.
So, yeah, that's where we're seeing with cable specifically.
Yeah.
That's okay.
So let's talk about cable and broadcast together, because that makes up around 40%.
Yep.
But beyond just fewer eyeballs, we know that there are less people watching cable and broadcast. What's the fundamental problem that business owners are facing if they put their video budgets into traditional TV?
Let's talk about TV as a whole. Or let's talk about broadcast first. I want to keep saying cable and broadcast. Here's where it gets confusing. I want to explain this a little bit better. What cable does is cable has the ability to watch all the broadcast channels. Cable does have a value that broadcast doesn't have. Broadcast is still going to be there, but you might be with your local CBS station and they have a very fragmented way that your inventory gets delivered, right? It might be to somebody still using antennas. Most of the smart TVs now come with built-in antenna just to get your local channels if you're able to, right? Then you have broadcast networks are on fast channels, which is the Pluto TVs, the Tubi. They're also on cable. So this is where it gets confusing, is that broadcast is in a category on its own, but when you're watching broadcast channel on a cable box, it actually gets counted towards that. Does that make sense?
There's some overlap there.
There's some overlap. Where I really want to talk about beyond just fewer eyeballs, with some of the problems that broadcast shares, the DVR ad skipping. Over 50% of primetime viewing is time shifted. So if you're watching anything on broadcast, whether you're using cable or satellite, you're skipping it, right? You got the DVR information going through. Even if they're getting it on YouTube TV, which is streaming, there is the DVR. It's the FAST that does a really good job, but that's all streaming. You want to be on something like FAST because they can't skip your commercial.
No.
The seasonal and inconsistency in broadcast. So it fluctuates between 18.5% and 23.5% based on sports seasons. One of the other struggles that they deal with is, to me, TV has a different kind of seasonality. But overall, people consuming content don't put it into a season, but it does happen that way for broadcast.
It does.
We're coming into another political year for midterms. So this year, broadcast is also going to face what they've always faced, is commercials get bumped and you're dealing with a political age.
It's going to be a big year.
One of the flaws with cable and broadcast is wasted reach. Zone-based buying in cable, DMA buying. For what I can do with streaming, I have the ability when I stream to, if I'm a business owner, a tire company that owns businesses in Indiana and Illinois, I would have to buy multiple TV stations to hit the DMA, or multiple buys with different cable companies specifically. I don't have to do that with streaming. I can be very specific with my zip codes and make sure that my delivery is there. Right. We'll talk about sports. Live sports is a little different. You usually, when you're buying live sports, you still are buying more DMA buying if you want to guarantee some of those buys. That's a different conversation. But yeah, those are two things right off the bat that I think about that are definitely flaws that is going to hurt somebody that's still living with their budget over with cable or broadcast. So bottom line, high cost for a declining audience with zero attribution. So we didn't even talk about attribution. That'll be my ROI conversation. I think what's happening is clients used to say, we've just always bought this way. We're very loyal. And I appreciate the loyalty. Just make sure your budget reflects that. If you're spending $300,000 a year and trying to reach people through video, and you spend the bulk of that on cable or a local TV buy, you really need to look at that budget and figure out how to build that viewership into a 70% viewership, not a 20% viewership.
Yeah. It's been a pretty grim.
I know. Anybody listening, if I get any sellers that listen from our competition, they're probably like, geez, Shannon, can you give us a break here?
Yeah, it's not to say that there's not value there. It's just that the value has shifted and it is a smaller audience. And like you said, your budget has to reflect that. And it's not that anything that they're doing wrong. It's just the changing nature of consumer behavior. And as consumers, when we change what we do and how we spend our time, businesses that are advertising need to make changes too, because you have to meet people where they are. If you're spending $300,000 on commercials that are getting seen by maybe 8% of your audience, hopefully.
Yeah.
That's bad math. That's really bad math. Let's talk about what streaming and CTV actually solve for advertisers. And you've hinted at it a couple of times. We mentioned a couple of things, but I want to have it all in one cluster. What makes streaming fundamentally better for business owners who are trying to reach their customers?
Okay, I'll break it down just a couple things to think about. Number one, I'm going to say better reach. And I don't know if the word better, because when you're talking 20% versus 50%, right? But we know that when about 48% of all TV viewing is happening through streaming, that's where the viewership is, then we know that is a real much stronger reach without having to buy multiple networks to get there. Number two, precision targeting. So we can do more zip code level. We can work with first party data and layer in AGF. We can we layer in those behaviors. We can layer in search retargeting. We have much more flexibility for targeting between geography and keywords and audience segments than you're going to get ever with broadcast. Cable's closest thing to targeting is who's watching sports versus who's watching Bravo. Much different. If you're picking one channel on cable with only 20% of viewership, you go down to about 1 or 2% of an audience, right? You got to keep running the numbers and chunk it down. Number 3, attribution. That ties into that targeting. I can track that somebody's watched that commercial and then came back to my website in 30 days. I can tell the completion rates. Are they watching it all the way through? We can do store visits if we're tying in a geofencing campaign to that. So full customer journey tracking as best as we can. Now we know that consumers on smart TV delivery are not clicking on it, but they sure can watch it and come back to your website. And there's huge value in that we've never been able to do with broadcast or cable. And
yeah, we've talked about the second screen phenomenon for years, right? Of people watching TV, but having their phones or tablets in front of them.
Absolutely.
I can tell you multiple stories about watching something and then, oh, that looks really cool. And then looking it up on my phone in that exact moment.
Who said it to me the other day? I can't remember who I was talking to. And they said, why somebody's watching, my husband's watching sports on TV and I'm catching up on my Bravo TV, my Real Housewives on my phone while he's watching that. And they're in the same room.
They're in the same room, but they're watching 2 different screens.
Yeah. And by the way, that phone, that is really big attribution because they can click on that and go right to my page.
Yes.
Huge value.
Absolutely.
And then last but not least, I would say flexible budgets. CTV is not inexpensive. It's more expensive than some things, but it's not more expensive than broadcast or cable. It's not. You buy what you pay what you get for. So if you're looking at about the same rates with more targeting and higher viewership, the ROI, I'm already answering our last question, but
Jeez, you didn't even give me a chance to
those are the main things I want a business owner to think about from the problems that CTV can solve.
Let's talk about the ROI specifically. How can businesses adjust their budgets to get a better ROI on their marketing? And what should they actually do right now with this information?
So I don't expect anybody to shift 100% overnight. In fact, I don't advise that. Just start by matching your allocation to actual viewership. And then let's just do the math. If a business is spending $200 a year on cable, if you matched viewership, about 100 to 115 of that would go towards streaming and about 45,000 would go towards cable. That's a massive rebalance, but that is how it should match. The ROI difference really with cable, you're guessing. With streaming, you have a better, it's not as good as what I can do with SEM because SEM is really telling me what's going on. It's not as good as what I can do with e-commerce. I know who's buying that, but it sure does tell us more information than broadcast or cable has ever been able to tell, which is ROI in itself. We can see that things are starting to change. And when it really comes to ROI has to always follow the consumer journey. So if that's where viewership is, follow the consumer journey and the ROI will follow that.
Absolutely. I love that. That's a beautiful clip right there.
That's a beautiful clip right there. You're envisioning your editing moments, right?
Yes, we're putting that on social. If you follow the consumer journey and make sure that you're matching your marketing throughout each step and telling the stories where you need to tell the stories, getting them when they're searching with SEM, you're going to see the money. The customers will come to you and they will buy from you.
Show me the money. I'm aging myself. What movie was that? Jerry Maguire?
Yep, Jerry Maguire. I watched that movie.
Okay.
I might have been when it came out. It was like 20 years after.
Well, all right. Thank you to our listeners for tuning in today. Remember, this is just part 1. And in our next episode in 2 weeks, we're going to be diving into live sports and streaming. Because if you think sports are still keeping cable alive, wait until you hear these numbers. Thanks for joining us and tune in to our next episode of Digital Marketing ROI.
You've been listening to Digital Marketing ROI from Federated Digital Solutions. Do you have an idea for a future episode or a burning digital marketing question? Text ROI to 45364 to get a link where you can share your idea. Subscribe to get new episodes every other Thursday, plus Tip Tuesday insights every week.
Podcasts by Federated Media.